Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, the Palestinian Authority president has appointed long-term ally and Fatah leader Mohammed Shatayyeh as prime minister. And this has drawn a lot of criticism from Hamas, a rival political group that runs the Gaza Strip. Some analysts view this appointment of the 61-year-old to replace outgoing Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah as part of Abbas's efforts to further isolate Hamas. What we will also be briefly touching at in this show are corruption charges that Benjamin Netanyahu is facing ahead of April general elections in Israel. He is the first Israeli prime minister to be put on official notice of a planned prosecution on charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust. Now, what will this do and how will it affect this potential indictment of Netanyahu to the future of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and also how the story unfolds? We'll be talking to our guests more on this ahead. With this, I would like to first of all welcome our guest who is with us, Dr. Basem Naim. He's the head of Council on International Relations. You're joining us from Gaza. Welcome to the show, Dr. Basem. Let me start off with you. First of all, the Prime Minister has been appointed by President Mahmoud Abbas. There's a lot of criticism being drawn by Hamas on being deliberately kept out on this procedure. What is your take on this?
Thank you very much. First of all, I have to say that the criticism is not only by Hamas. You can say it is a criticism by nearly all Palestinian factions, because we consider, the Palestinian factions, we're considering this government as an illegitimate government formed by an illegitimate president, because the presidential time ended in 2009, and since that time the renewal of the presidential time is based on no legal basis. Second, it is only isolating the group in Ramallah by forming a government which is ruling only within Ramallah. They have no say in Gaza, they have no say in Jerusalem and the most of the West Bank. What we have said for a long time with most of other Palestinian factions, we have to form a unity government representing all Palestinian factions, including Hamas. And this government have to prepare as a first duty of this government to prepare for a comprehensive elections, presidential elections, legislative council elections, and national council election to renew and to reform the whole political Palestinian system. Without taking these steps, as I said, a unity government and comprehensive election, we are talking again about a new step by President Abbas, which is deepening the division between the Palestinians, which is making the whole Palestinian political theater more complicated by such isolated steps.
But Dr. Basem, what do you think gave Mr. Mahmoud Abbas the courage, the confidence to go ahead and do this, knowing that this disagreement between key political factions within Palestine is actually detrimental to the cause of Palestine?
Simply because he failed to persuade all Palestinian factions, including Hamas and Jihad and PFLP and DFLP and other factions, smaller factions, to participate in the government. Then he decided, and he already sent the former Prime Minister Alhamdulillah, he sent him home, and he is now working on forming a new government. When he failed to persuade all other Palestinian factions to participate in this government, he has no choice than to form an isolated government, which, as I said, it will only deepening the division between the Palestinians.
And this is not the first time this has happened. This approach was also taken in 2007 when it came to the Prime Minister being appointed then, Mr. Salam Fayyad, right?
Yes, in 2007 and 2014, when he assigned Prime Minister Alhamdulillah, in all of these cases, he decided alone, isolated, to assign, to form a government without consulting other factions and without participating of any other factions except part of Fatah. Even the other half of Fatah, which is led by Mr. Mohammed Dahalan, is not accepting the forming of the new government. Therefore, as I said, this is an isolated step which will lead to more deepening the division between the Palestinians, and it will serve only the Israeli plans to divide the Palestinians, to control the rest of the West Bank, and paving the way for the coming what's so-called century deal of Trump, which is more or less giving, as I said, the Israelis the green light to control the rest of the West Bank and to Jewedize Jerusalem and to announce the Jewish state on the rest of the land.
So, Dr. Basem, please stay with me while I introduce our Mr. Muslim Imran. You're the president of the Palestinian Cultural Organization, and you're joining us today from Istanbul. Welcome to Newswire. Let me ask you this. How do you see Shataya's impact on Gaza, especially? Will it be in favor of Gaza, especially considering the criticism that is erupting from different political factions on the way he was nominated and appointed as the Prime Minister?
Thank you, Ayza. I think the move of President Abbas to appoint Mohammed Shataya as the Prime Minister is one more political maneuver to consolidate power. It is very unfortunate that President Abbas failed to engage the rest of the Palestinian political factions. He actually had the opportunity to engage other PLO factions, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other Palestinian political forces in order to pave the way for a Palestinian reconciliation and national elections. He missed that opportunity. I can't find any justification for missing such opportunity, especially that we are at a time where the American and Israeli pressure on our struggle is
mounting. It is mounting, but
beyond any.
Let me plug in another question here, just to clarify for our viewers, because there seems to be in the international community a lot of confusion when it comes to what kind of difference in ideology exists in the first place when it comes to the Fatah faction and the Hamas. So what is the difference in the ideology between the two?
I think, Ayza, it's not an ideological schism. It's a difference in political strategy. Both Palestinian factions are seeking Palestinian freedom and independence. They have worked together previously in the 2006 to 2007 National Unity Government. They can work together. It's not a matter of ideology. It's a matter of leadership. Palestinian president has, I would say, disregarded the Palestinian constitution, the Palestinian political system, and he has been missing so many opportunities. As a Palestinian, I feel very disappointed that we can't work together at a time where we have to face mounting pressure from the outside. There isn't that much of political difference. Both Fatah and Hamas are Palestinian liberation movements. Yes, there are some probably political affiliations for each one of them, but at the end of the day, they both seek liberation of the Palestinian land, and they have signed consecutive reconciliation pacts. We have seen over the last 10 years almost 10 Palestinian reconciliation pacts.
Right. And they have continuously disintegrated.
What is happening now?
They have continuously disintegrated as a result of differences when it comes to power sharing. It comes to how...
It's because of leadership. I would say it's because of leadership. Hamas has been facing mounting pressure from Israel in the Gaza Strip in particularly. The Palestinians in general are facing huge pressure. President Abbas is now facing American pressure, not only Israeli pressure. So there is no reason why they shouldn't work together. I believe that Hamas has given a good signal about a year and a half ago when they accepted to give up power in Gaza in return for national reconciliation. That opportunity has been missed by President Abbas. Now, when he appointed a Fatah leader, he further sidelines the rest of the Palestinian political forces, and
so he is
missing one more opportunity.
Right. Let me ask you, Dr. Basem, if we are to interpret this correctly? Is this the view across the board also, that the leadership is the problem here, that continuously isolating Hamas despite gestures being made for a unity government are being ignored because of outside pressure?
I think we have here in Hamas given many chances to put things on the right track. We have signed different agreements in Cairo, in Doha, in Riyadh, but the problem was always that the leadership in Ramallah, I mean President Abbas and his group, they have refused and rejected any implementation of these agreements. Therefore, we have shifted to the other choice. If a consensus between the different factions is not successful to put the national struggle on the right track, let us go to the second choice, which is election. We have said it clearly. If we form a unity government representing all Palestinian factions, and the main task of this unity government is to prepare for national legislative and presidential election, and we give the Palestinians the chance to decide who is the leader and how to lead, and what is the strategy of the Palestinian people in facing the coming pressure from the Israelis, from the Americans, and from the region. And we think that this is the right way and the right moment to reform the whole system. It is the system is corrupted, is aging. We cannot look today. PLO National Council is representing Palestinians, excluding Hamas and Jihad and PFLP and DFLP and half of Fatah led by Mr. Dahalan and other small factions. Who is represented by this national council if all these factions are excluded? Therefore, we have said it clearly.
So, Dr. Basem, what stops President Mahmoud Abbas from holding these elections, from giving an equal say to the people for them to represent their leaders?
Simply because he knows that he will lose. Because he knows that his track, 25 years of trial with the Israelis through after Oslo agreement, failed, totally failed, collapsed. What we see it today, after 25 years of Oslo agreement, before Oslo, we have had nearly 100,000 settlers in the West Bank. Today, we have nearly 750,000 settlers. 60% of the West Bank is totally controlled by the Israelis. The hundreds of thousands of the Palestinians kicked out from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is Jewidized totally. Therefore, this political project has failed, and therefore he knows he will fail. And his group, and I am sure that part of his group is not thinking only of political interests of the Palestinians. They are thinking of their own private interests. They became, through this, including this new man, Muhammad Shtaya, he one of the fat cats who became very rich based on the donations directed to the Palestinian people.
Right. Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Basem. Let me move back to Mr. Muslim, trying to understand the reason for the talks that have failed continuously, whether it was not just with Hamas and other factions, but basically the concern has always been that Mahmoud Abbas has been acting on outside influences. Now, talking a little about also how Benjamin Netanyahu is facing corruption charges, if he is indicted, if he is removed, hypothetically speaking, how does this affect the constant friction between the factions in PLA?
I believe Israel is one of the main actors when it comes to the Palestinian issue. If Israeli influence over President Abbas and the political system was not there, Palestinians would have united long ago. In fact, Israel has used many instruments, including financial instruments, to further divide the Palestinians. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it clear several times. It's either talks with me or talks with Hamas. This was made clear to President Abbas. So his pressure and his government's pressure on the Palestinian political system and on President Abbas made it difficult for the Palestinians to reconcile. But again, President Abbas has to also make his choices clear. He cannot accept to succumb to Israeli pressures and to American pressures, and at the same time isolate himself from the rest of the Palestinians and isolate himself from working with Hamas and the rest of the Palestinian factions. We need a reconciliation. And I'm not talking about division of government portfolios. I'm talking about national reconciliation, national dialogue, a reform agenda where the Palestinian political system will be revived and reformed. We have had the last real elections in 2006, and that is very disappointing. 13 years without refreshing the Palestinian political system. Elections might not be the solution, though. Palestinian elections might be held tomorrow, and most probably Hamas and other resistance factions will win these elections, and we will continue to face the same kind of divided political system that we have seen, because I don't believe President Abbas is going to accept the results of such elections. That's why I'm thinking about reconciliation as the way out. Palestinians have to sit down together, have to have a national dialogue, have to think of their struggle, of their strategy, how to end Israeli occupation. The people on the ground have proved that they are willing to sacrifice, they are willing to do a lot for their nation. You've seen the Great Return March in Gaza, you've seen the Intifada taking place in Jerusalem and in the rest of the West Bank. So people are giving up their lives for their nation. Why don't the leadership do so?
Essentially are saying is that maybe the elections aren't even the solution. The problem lies in the leadership.
It's not going to be a solution.
Mr. Abbas, right now with here, let me bring in another voice to this conversation. Mr. Antony Loewenstein, he's a journalist joining us from Jerusalem. Welcome to Newswire. Mr. Anthony, trying to put some light, some perspective. First of all, let me start with this. How do you see the point of view that it is a political perspectives the political perspective of Israel is to actually see these political factions, Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, at loggerheads with the Palestinian Authority. Is this a correct perspective to see?
Completely. One of the things that Israel has done very successfully for about 2 decades in many ways is to keep Palestinians divided. Any Palestinian leader, male or female, including many politicians from both the government in Fatah or the Hamas government, often are imprisoned for years with no particular charges in Israeli prisons, often in the West Bank, in terrible conditions. And one of the things that Israel has tried very successfully to do, with, I might add, much international support, you don't hear a great deal of actual serious criticism from the Americans or the Europeans and others. Yes, the Europeans do sometimes complain, but what are they doing about it practically? So what Israel's done very successfully is made any potential Palestinian leader imprisoned, jailed, or detained. And that makes any kind of potential Palestinian liberation movement very, very difficult to succeed.
And now that we see Benjamin Netanyahu facing corruption charges, as the Attorney General just recently announced, the Israeli Attorney General, of indicting him, do you see that this could, in a way, affect, first of all, Netanyahu's chances of winning the elections? And if it does, how does this, in long term, affect the divide that we see in the Palestinian Authority?
I mean, Israel's situation is quite strange because the indictment was announced about 2 weeks ago here in Israel. I'm based in Jerusalem. And initially the opinion polls showed that Netanyahu's support was dropping. However, opinion polls a few days ago on the weekend, in fact, showed his support going back up again. What I think you have to understand is that many Israelis, not all, but many, view the indictment against him as a political witch hunt. They do not see him as innocent. Sorry, they don't see him as guilty, and in fact they see him as innocent. And even if they do see him as guilty, they don't think it's a major issue. I mean, in the scheme of things, one thing that's very frustrating as a journalist here, often working in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, is that in terms of the major issues and alleged crimes Netanyahu has committed, corruption is the least of the problems. I mean, let's think about it. Occupation for many years, killings in Gaza, corruption, the alleged corruption is least of, frankly, what Netanyahu has been doing in the last 10 years. The effect, though, of his indictment might mean, I think if there was an election held today, there's a decent chance actually he might win. The election, of course, is in 1 month. And even if he doesn't win, the likely opposition parties, sadly, when it comes to the issue of Palestine and the occupation, their policies are remarkably similar. No one is seriously talking here about ending the occupation. Nobody. Palestinians are, of course.
Right. So
but
essentially, whatever the result from Israel, the stance is going to be the same when it comes to Palestine. Now, with that, let me welcome another guest who's joining us from Dr. Sami Al-Arian. He's the director of Center for Islam and Global Affairs. Welcome to Newswire. So one view is that the appointment of the Prime Minister Mohammad Shtayyeh, the Fatah leader, long-term ally of Mahmoud Abbas, does not help the current conflict that is between the Palestinian factions. What is your take on this?
Well, Mohammad Shtayyeh is a senior leader in Fatah organization. So now for many years, supposedly the Palestinian government, the Palestinian Authority, has been led by someone who is supposed to be independent, even though Mr. Abbas has been controlling this government. Now, for the first time, you have a Fatah leader named as the head of the government. As far as that is concerned, then we're talking about it's a Fatah government rather than being a national government representing all factions or Palestinians or at least technocrats. So on that perspective, the factions would be looking to see if Mr. Shtayyeh would be having an independent voice in which he can use the other, or at least extend his hand to the other factions and try to reach reconciliation. That's doubtful, since Mr. Abbas actually is the one who's controlling the shots, and he's not interested in having real reconciliation with Hamas or the other Palestinian factions. As far as Israel is concerned, Israeli policy has always been that the Palestinian Authority is supposed to be in the West Bank simply to protect Israel's security. They're not interested in any kind of reconciliation between the factions. Actually, it serves their purpose to have these factions always divided and to have basically Mr. Abbas as a person who is looked at by the Palestinian people as someone who is dictator and not trying to resolve the Palestinian question, generally speaking, and the inter-Palestinian relations by having reconciliation with Hamas and the other factions.
There's also a power-sharing dispute that continues between the West Bank and Gaza Strip, where Hamas, though resoundingly won the elections in 2006, continues to say they have the popular vote, and that is something that Mahmoud Abbas completely refuses to recognize.
We have to understand that Abbas is not an independent person. He is basically calling the shots that are being given to him by the US and Israel for the most part, because they control his funding. So, and you could say that basically for the past couple of years, he's being denying Gaza its fair share of the taxes that they are paying, kind of aid, and he's being basically tightening the screws in terms of any kind of aid, salaries, different kinds of obligations that he's supposed to give. That is not necessarily a Palestinian position that he favors, but these are the conditions imposed on him by Israel and the United States for them to keep bankrolling him and giving him the funds that he needs to control the West Bank.
Right. And Mr. Anthony, then hearing this perspective, which is pretty much the popular understanding around the world of what is exactly happening, who is backing the Palestinian Authority, and as opposed to what is the conflict with Hamas and other resistant factions there in Palestine, what, in your opinion, is the key issue, the key move that will resolve this problem here?
Well, in some ways, many young Palestinians think the Palestinian Authority should be abolished entirely. It is a dictatorship here in Palestine. It does not speak for many, many Palestinians. Yes, the Palestinian Authority pays many salaries, to be sure, but also, as you rightly said before, neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority won elections any time recently. The elections were years and years ago. They essentially are police states repressing their own people. This is both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. What many young Palestinians who I speak to in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and indeed in Gaza are saying is we need to form a kind of civil rights movement. One person, one vote. There's an Israeli election on April the 9th. Literally less than 1 in 4 Palestinians can vote in that election, and yet the result of that election will clearly affect their lives. And that sort of reality, I think, is growing in many places around the world, including, I might add, in the US, where growing numbers of Jews in the Jewish community, I'm Jewish myself, are saying, not in my name. You do not speak for us, Israel. You do not claim to represent all world Jews, and therefore it's vital now that there is growing pressure on American politicians, particularly the Democratic side, to change policy to be far more critical of the occupation. That, to me, is the key. Yes, Israeli politics needs to change, but most activists you speak to here in Israel and Palestine know that without outside pressure, namely the Europeans and the Americans and elsewhere in the world, the situation will never change. So there needs to be radical political shifting in the US, and I do see some positive indications of that. It's hard to see that with the Trump administration currently in power, but you do see in the Democratic Party growing very vocal voices. Ayza Omar, a young congresswoman just recently, has been very outspoken, in my view, very bravely, challenging the reality of what is happening here in Palestine, paid for by the US.
Right.
So they're the kind of changes we're looking for, and I think they're very positive.
So the grassroots activism and the general know-how and the knowledge of what exactly is happening that is usually getting swept under the rug by international politics and jingoism. Mr. Sami, this question is to you. How realistic is that change, especially in light of greater regional powers, whether it's Qatar or it's Iran, whether it's Saudi Arabia or the US or Israel, linking themselves to these political factions? In your view, sir, how realistic is there a possibility of the Palestinian factions coming together to resist Israel's attempt to continue their differences?
Well, if it was up to the Israelis, obviously they would like to keep that division and even growing that division. When it comes to regional powers, most regional powers are basically controlled by outside powers, very, very small number of countries that can make their own decisions, like Iran and Turkey and some other few countries. The others are pretty much relying to the line of the US and Israel. When it comes to the regional situation, Israel is trying to change the discourse by painting Iran as being the enemy of the region, by trying to ally itself with regional powers such as Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Jordan, and Egypt, as well as other small countries. The point is to try to divert from the focus of the central issue in the region, which is the Palestinian predicament and the Palestinian problem. When it comes to the Palestinians, their role obviously is to stay steadfast and try to, as much as possible, unite in their ability to resist the occupation. Israeli society today is pretty much controlled by the right wing. There is very little hope to see any kinds of movement. The two-state solution is dead. As your other speaker has pointed out, we're talking about the possibility of either an apartheid regime or one state. I think eventually the world will wake up to the point that you cannot have an apartheid regime in the 21st century. This would be totally unacceptable to the rest of the world, which will eventually lead to one-state solution. Whether that happens sooner rather than later, as people hope, whether that happens bloodless or with a lot of shedding of blood until people wake up to find out that this is totally unacceptable. Right. What the Israeli right wing is trying to do is to create Bundestans in Palestine, in the West Bank, as well as, if they have the opportunity, to deport as many Palestinians outside Palestine as possible. The idea is to keep the land and dispossess the people.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Sami, and also Antony, for joining us here on Newswire. And we'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire. Now, Yemen's warring sides have traded blame after more than 20 civilians, including women and children, were killed in a village that has been gripped by fighting for weeks. The Houthis, who control large parts of Yemen, claim the elements of the Hajur tribe have been stockpiling weapons provided by the Saudi-led coalition and bringing fighters into the area, a breach of a 6-year-old truce that has seen the Hajur remain neutral throughout the current conflict. How objectively can we see this and understand whether this violation of ceasefire is a result of more than what meets the eye? To discuss this further, let me introduce our guests who are joining us today. We have Mr. Mawry, who is joining us from Detroit, and he is a Yemeni political expert, and journalist. And also we have Mr. Obaida Hitto, a journalist joining us from Istanbul. Welcome to the show, both of you. Let me start with you, Mr. Yousef Mawry. The current conflict, of course, is very sad indeed. So many lives continue to be lost, again, mostly women and children. Is this a violation of the ceasefire as we can simply understand it, or there's more that meets the eye?
It's unfortunately not a violation of the ceasefire agreement that was signed in Sweden in December of 2018. That ceasefire only stipulated that both parties would redeploy their military forces from the province of Hodeidah. And of course, that's still in conflict. What's happening in the province of Hajjah is another problem that's manifesting into something that people in Yemen were not expecting. And as you mentioned, this was as a result of the violation of the 6-year truce between the tribe of Hajr and the Houthi movement. What the Houthis are saying is this tribe, it basically allowed coalition forces into their territory, and the agreement stipulated that this area would remain neutral and it would not help out either side. Neither would it let the Houthis into that area, nor would it allow the coalition forces to advance in that part of the region. Now, the Houthis, they claim that this was a transgression against this agreement, which forced or resulted in clashes between both sides over the past 3 weeks. According to sources on the ground, the Houthis have managed to take over of that area. They defeated the tribe of Hajr, and now the area is in complete control of the Houthis, according to some reports and some sources from the ground.
Right. And coming to you, Mr. Obaida, how do you see this as more infighting, as it seems, continues, and at the cost of innocent children, women, who the death toll continues to rise?
The human cost of the Yemeni war is unprecedented. The UN envoy to Yemen expressed it very clearly, saying that there's no reason why innocent civilians should be dying in this conflict that is obviously basically perceptible to a resolution. They've been trying. The UN. The point is that the UN has been trying to get a resolution through a peaceful transition from an armed conflict to some kind of political dialogue. They tried this in Geneva. They've tried this most recently again in Sweden with the ceasefire and in Hodeidah and the delivery of humanitarian aid. But the reality on the ground remains that both of the parties involved in the conflict have taken this opportunity to reposition themselves in Yemen.
Let me come to you, Mr. Yousef. The UN recognizes the Houthis as a political group and that they have the right to form a Yemeni government per se, but they also add a little bit of a contradiction to that they cannot be a military power that the Houthis can hold indiscriminately over the area. What does that translate into any kind of effective resolution?
Well, like you said, the UN recognizes the Houthis as a political movement, a movement that should not impose its will by resulting to force. However, the Houthi as a group, they view the current status quo in Yemen in 2000 under the leadership of President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi, that this was a illegitimate government that was sponsoring and aiding the interests of Saudi Arabia. So therefore, they were forced to act upon the aspirations of the Yemeni people and remove this Saudi-backed government from power. This is why they came from the North Province of Saada and took over the capital, Sana'a. This is where the problem lies. This is, if you want to pinpoint the problem, is the UN recognizing the Houthis as a political entity only. They don't seem to recognize them as the actual authority government in Sana'a, a group that has managed to win a large portion of the Yemeni people who are supporting their cause, supporting the fight against the coalition forces who have killed thousands and thousands of Yemenis by airstrikes. And this is something that the UN is struggling to cope with, the fact that the Houthi movement, they have support. They're strategically and militarily advancing on the coalition-backed forces in Hodeidah. The Houthis seem to be winning the battle on the ground. They won the battle in the province of Hajjah. So the UN can't bring an end to the Houthis militarily. Therefore, they're forced to propose a peace initiative which calls on the Houthis to hand over their weapons and to resume political dialogue between both sides.
But hold that thought, Mr. Yousef. Mr. Obaida, we were talking about the UN's role here. They've also proposed and promoted the idea of handing over power to a friendly government. Now, what does this mean? How do we define or understand what a friendly government in Yemen means?
So this government that's in exile at this point in Riyadh is where it's mostly based. It is basically calling for further support to take the fight to the Houthis. As the guest mentioned, the Houthis are the ones who are dominating on the ground militarily. The ceasefire in Hodeidah and other humanitarian kinds of initiatives are only stopgaps to the reality on the ground. This particular conflict or this particular incident in northern Yemen is significant because this is a very sensitive geographic region. It's right on the border with Saudi Arabia. This is right on the front lines of where all the coalition forces are based. This question about the airstrikes hitting civilians, this is something that's been repeated. There's violations that are documented by international bodies on both sides of the conflict. So the fact that the human loss of life continues amidst UN efforts kind of delegitimizes even any kind of recognized government, whether it be the government in exile or the Houthis trying to establish their own government outside of the purview of the UN. The question here is that there is a platform for these conflicting parties to get together and to stop the loss of human life, but they are using this political dialogue to buy time or to gain advantage on the ground, strategic advantage, so that they can strengthen their negotiating positions at the negotiating table. And it's unfortunate that this is the way the politics are playing out. The Saudis and the UAE, they were hoping that these tribes, this particular tribe, the Hajar tribe, might be interested in changing its neutral position. This might actually push them over the edge, but it seems like since the Houthis are blaming UAE for conducting this airstrike, that this is not going to be working out in favor of Saudi and the UAE. There are also reports that the Houthis had killed one of the tribal leaders or several members of the tribe as they were taking over this region. So it's not clear exactly where this region is going to fall in terms of on the axis or on the spectrum of pro-anti-Houthi coalition, or if it's going to be pro-Houthi in terms of their alliance. But definitely this is an example of why this conflict needs to come to an end.
All right.
Civilians are the biggest victims
in this ongoing
armed
war.
Struggle.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Hitto, your insight. Now, coming back to you, Mr. Yousef, what, in your opinion, was the cause, the reason behind a truce that had held on for so long, for 6 years, where the Hajar tribe had remained neutral throughout?
Saudi influence. Saudi Arabia, coalition forces, they managed to get in contact with this tribe, and which forced them to compromise the agreement they had with the Houthis, and this is why the conflict ensued, and this is why that area is no longer under the tribe of the Hajuri tribe. It's under Houthi control. The main problem is the UN, the US, Saudi Arabia, the coalition forces, they don't want to deal with a militarized Houthi movement. They would prefer to deal with a political Houthi movement. However, what that spells out for the Houthis is suicide. If the Houthis withdraw their forces from Hodeidah, from Sana'a, if they hand over their military power, there's not going to be any political negotiations. They're not going to sit in peaceful dialogue in Geneva, in Sweden, or even in Yemen. What's going to happen is the coalition forces, along with the bombardments by Saudi Arabia, they're going to look to eliminate the Houthis.
But
and
why? Why is Hodeidah the bone of contention here? Can you draw out for us simplistically the importance that Hodeidah holds?
Well, Hodeidah is the gateway for 90% of the humanitarian aid and 90% of the imports coming from the world. If the port of Hodeidah is closed, if it's sieged, then 90% of the country's goods won't be able to enter the country, which would lead to essentially millions and millions of people struggling to find food. Of course, there's been reports of over 85,000 Yemeni children who have starved to death as a result of the blockade on humanitarian aid. So this is what it really boils down to. Will the UN, will the international community recognize that this is this Houthi movement it's not a normal, they're they're not weak. They have capability to do a lot of damage, as has been empirically proven on the ground. Another thing I want to mention is, if we listen to the Houthi leader's speech last week, he basically said time is of the essence. The Houthi movement, the Ansar Allah movement, they won't continue to engage in these peaceful negotiations if the coalition forces, the Hadi-backed government, continues to violate their end of the deal. And what he's basically alluding to is that the Houthi movement, the Ansar Allah movement, they're ready and capable of taking complete control of Hodeidah by military operations. So according to the Houthis, they're on standby. Their pieces are in the right places, and they're ready to advance if the UN does not bring about a lasting peace between both sides.
Right. And here I'd like to welcome one more guest to the conversation. We've got the last 5 minutes, so we've got to wrap this up quickly. Miss Bushra Nasar is joining us from Sweden. You're an activist. Welcome to Newswire. Very quickly, you agree with the idea that the Houthis have no longer any confidence in the peace agreement because it would involve withdrawing from Hodeidah, and they have no trust that the coalition forces, the Hadi's government, would hold true to their end of the bargain.
Let me thank you very much, everybody here. First of all, the Houthis has never been adhered to any agreement since they have been on 2004. We have been seeing many of them flipping over their agreements and flipping over their allies as well. Houthis have flipped over the agreement and again through these 3 months just some breathtaking and readjusting themselves, because what's happening now is Hujur. Hujur is a state next to Hodeidah, and they have been sieging that place for 2 months for 200,000 people, preventing even them food and everything. And in the last 2 days, they defeated them, and they are doing genocide in these areas. As soon as this happened, now they are saying that they're going to flip over the agreement. They never adhered to this agreement. What is happening? They don't care even about the starvations. They don't care about Yemeni starvations. This is their policies. We know those people, Hashemite groups, 4,000 years. The conflict is not born just yesterday. The conflict in Yemen is 1,000 years ago. We have got rid of those Hashemite, those supremacist people, in 1962, when the revolution and the Republic of Yemen evolved. The state of Yemen is saying, and it has been calling the UN to reveal who are the one who are not adhering to the
so if you're saying, what you're saying, Ms. Bushra, is that the Houthis never played by the rules to begin with. They never adhered to the peace agreement. But could there be a possibility that the Saudi-led coalition or the coalition forces have bought over the loyalties of the tribe, which had so far held their neutrality in the past 6 years?
On this part, the Saudis have held their neutralities or have been playing a role in Yemen since the revolution 1962. They have been playing a role with the tribal system in Yemen. This is not something newly done by the Saudis, because Saudis' stability of Yemen was for the sake of Saudis. What is happening right now? Is that the UN agreement, the Stockholm agreement, was just the wishes for the humanitarian crisis, to take place. As soon as the agreement, during the agreement, they were bombarding the storages in Hodeidah. The WFP, David Beasley, on the 19th of November, just after the UN Security Council, when they were trying to put together they were pushing for this Stockholm Agreement, when the government or the state was just 4 kilometers away from the Hodeidah to preventing them for this advancing and for this hostility to go on. He said 2 days after on the CNN, he said that the coalition is supporting with the relief of aid and the distribution and access to aid, while the Houthis, they found 7 mines in their silos. They are being by this what do you call it,
right. But this is these allegations have been thrown on either side, Ms. Bushra. But before we get sucked into that debate on who held humanitarian aid from whom, let me quickly go to you, Mr. Yousef. This is true in terms of critics and analysts commenting on Houthis not playing by the rules, not adhering to past agreements.
Yes, I was just alluding to the fact that your guest mentioned that the Houthis are committing all types of atrocities. They're not abiding by the agreements. She failed to mention that 43 innocent civilians, among whom women and children, were killed just yesterday by Saudi airstrikes in the province of Hajjah. And the reason why they did that is because the Houthis are in control of that area. So Saudi Arabia does what it naturally does when it doesn't get what it wants. It results into killing innocent civilians. The Houthis, look, the fact of the matter is...
They have killed 62 and they have been bombing for 2 days now. 257 people are injured. They are, the UN and the world are silent about Hujur. What is happening?
Well,
and if there is an attack by the coalition, yes, and they have been attacking the Houthis.
Hang on, Ms. Bushra. Hang on, Ms. Bushra. Let me hear Mr. Yousef out, and I will come back to you and let you have your say.
Sure.
A lot of these commentators and pundits, they like to maintain somewhat. They like to think that they're maintaining an objective position when it comes to reporting about the war in Yemen. They're not providing any context. You can't just point at the Houthis and blame them for everything, blame them for killing innocent civilians, when the fact of the matter is there's a long list of thousands and tens of thousands of innocent civilians killed by Saudi Arabia. What you have to...
No, I understand where you're going, Mr. Yousef. The idea here is that there is an international. Ms. Bushra, what he's trying to say, this is a regional play of powers that come in, and not just Houthi versus a Yemeni government. So, at the end of the day, do you recognize that there are international powers who are doing their own proxy war within Yemen or not?
I agree on this. The problem is
they want the Houthis.
Let me go to Ms. Bushra first, and then I'll quickly come back to you, Mr. Yousef.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree with you that this is a proxy war, but the layer of this, the root of the conflict, I have been studying how to address the conflict. You have to get to the root of the conflict. The root of the conflict is supremacy. They have been classifying Yemen for 1,000 years of 5 categories. If we want to have it local conflict, we have to adhere to this, and we sit on the tables as just. This is number one. Number two, the state and everybody should understand that these groups, and it has been mentioned in Peter Vincent Prey, he's the executive director of the National Security in America. He said the next 9/11 is going to come through those radical people. We have to understand that all these wishes of putting them together on the table is just wishes. I wish they sit on the table with the good notion that they will adhere to these agreements. I wish. I said many times, Stockholm was a very good opportunity. I was so happy with Stockholm.
Let me give Mr. Yousef a chance to give his closing statement, because we have to wrap up in 60 seconds. Go ahead, Mr. Yousef.
Just based on this propaganda that your guest has been spewing,
Let me just hear him out. Go ahead.
This is the same propaganda that's being parroted by Saudi Arabia and the coalition forces, that the Houthis, they think that they're the masters, that because they're from the bloodline of Prophet Muhammad, that they think that they can control Yemen and rule whoever they want to. These allegations are funny, and the fact that there's somebody who's the journalist and who's these allegations.
And the government of Sana'a now, you removed everybody from the government of Sana'a and putting only Hashemite names now. Sorry.
What she's saying right now is this is the reason why the Houthis will not withdraw from Sana'a. This is why the Houthis will not hand over their military power, because you have people like Bushra who are represented by the Hadi government who are lying to the people that the Houthis are evil. And that
one second, Ms. Bushra, let him finish. Very quickly, Mr. Yousef, we've run out of time now.
I would appreciate if Bushra just says in point blank, we don't want the Houthis in Yemen. We don't want them to be part of the government. We don't want them to have any power whatsoever. This is why the ultimate goal.
I want them to be a political process. Through a political process. Let go of the weapon.
Okay, so this will be a all right. Unfortunately,
you are not taking my words. Right.
If I may finish my point, please. This is why the Houthis, if they withdraw or if they hand over their weapons, it would lead to suicide, because people like her would advocate for bringing a complete end to the Ansar law.
Hang on, Ms. Bushra. So the political solution, what is the political solution? If all parties were to put down their arms, can we reach any kind of agreement?
First of
Mr.
all,
Yousef, this is for you.
The Houthis have mentioned that their goal is to hand over all military manifestations, weapons, heavy artillery, heavy armored vehicles to a Yemeni government that represents the sentiments of the Yemeni people. They want to hand power over. They want to hand authority over in Sana'a, in Hodeidah, in all the areas that they control to a Yemeni government that represents the sentiments and the demands of the Yemeni people. They will not hand over power to a government that represents the interests of Saudi Arabia, which we've seen in 2012.
All right, no, I'll stop you there, Mr. Yousef. We've completely run. Hang on, Mr. Yousef. I got your point. I think Ms. Bushra also does. Ms. Bushra, your last 30 seconds. What is the solution, the political solution? You heard Mr. Yousef's version. Do you agree with that or not? And what is your take on it?
I believe, first of all, that they have to sit on the table as just, get rid of this notion, number one. Number two, roll back the whole tape. Roll back the whole tape. The coalition came in because they went into many cities. They went in up to Aden. They should roll back. Get back to the areas. We should sit. We understand. They have some oppressions. We have said that there is the 30 million people also has some oppressions. This is going to be dealt through transitional justice. They should sit on a we should get back on a political process. They should convert to a political party and start a political process. The whole political process stopped because of them and the COPE.
All right. Thank you so much, Ms. Bushra and Yousef, for your insight there. A very contentious issue indeed, whether there is a political solution to the Houthis and the Yemeni government backed by coalition forces or not. And we'll keep you up to date with the news on Indus News. Keep watching. This was Newswire with Ayza Omar. Goodbye.